What is strength and what is weakness? What does it mean to be weak, and what does it mean to be strong? I've been plagued by these questions for many years now, not only when I was progressing through childhood into my teenage years, but also more recently as I progress further into young adulthood. When we think of weakness, it's typically along the lines of deficiency, where we lack something or we're inadequate in some manner. I'm not strong enough, or I wasn't strong enough, could refer to the lack of physical strength, or it could refer to a deficiency of will and moral character. Irrespective of what we're referring to, it's natural for us to avoid and even go so far as despise weakness. After all, when you're weak, you find yourself in a vulnerable state that can and will be exploited by several kinds of dangers. Meanwhile, the opposite of this vulnerable state is strength and confidence that fosters security. When I'm strong, I feel secure in myself, my surroundings, and my situation. I realize that I can handle uncertainty because I possess the courage to overcome it. When I'm weak and vulnerable, however, my confidence is diminished, and I doubt my ability to endure. If you've ever experienced these thoughts, then you're not alone. Everyone is plagued by them at some point, especially when we encounter situations that truly test our will and threaten everything we stand for. Today's discussion primarily focuses on the assertion that you cannot afford to be weak, and I should note up front that I don't by any means make these remarks in a condescending manner, but rather with pragmatism and personal experience in mind. Having experienced varying degrees of weakness and insufficiency in my existence thus far, I make these remarks with the key intention of sparing you further trouble and hardship. You cannot afford to be weak because it will be exploited, and to avoid this outcome you must therefore be strong instead, for as long as possible and to the greatest extent possible. To drive the point home, I will describe how I interpret weakness by denoting what falls under its umbrella and what does not. Next, I will elaborate on the necessity to become strong and avoid weakness. Finally, through notable personal experiences, I will outline practical methods you can utilize to become strong and emerge from vulnerable periods, despite life's inevitable hardships and tragedies. To begin, weaknesses can be fundamentally separated into two more or less exclusive camps: weaknesses that we can't control and weaknesses that we can control. But sometimes this distinction becomes blurred. The former constitutes inherent disadvantages, whereas the latter constitutes willful deficiencies in will and character. Although weaknesses, I'm not considering the former to be encapsulated in my title statement and key assertion of why you cannot afford to be weak. This is because, as aforementioned, we don't have control over these events and circumstances. If a person is born with a physical or mental disability or deadly disease, they can't be faulted for having an inherent disadvantage. If someone who is essentially healthy is diagnosed seemingly out of nowhere with a debilitating disease, then they too can't be faulted. When I think of these people who endure despite their sufferings, I not only sympathize with them, but I also respect them, because they have every right to be upset with the hands they've been dealt. Yet, they persist and continue to make the best of circumstances. It's evidently a reality check for me when I become frustrated due to any pains or setbacks, because they're nothing compared to what others are enduring. If they can choose to be strong in the midst of severe hardships and pains, then why can't I? If they can choose to focus on the positive aspects of existence despite their immense sufferings, then why can't I do the same when I experience relatively minor pains and inconveniences? These people aren't weak, they're the strongest of us all, and we should take notes on their examples. I digress on this point for now, but I'll return to it later. So, that's one manner to interpret weakness, as an arbitrarily inflicted disability or disadvantage. But the manner in which I'm interpreting weakness for today's discussion is that of willful deficiency, or inadequacy. In situations where we have a choice to either be strong or weak, where we have control over it, this is what I'm zeroing in on. In cases where you can decide, then you must avoid weakness and choose strength instead. If this distinction is still not clicking, here are two examples. First example. A kid is bullied by an older and much larger kid because the aggressor possesses greater physical strength compared to the victim, say a 10-year-old compared to a 7-year-old. We would be hard-pressed to fault the younger kid for being bullied since they're weak, or deficient, simply due to the fact that they're younger. They can't be faulted for the difference in stature, an inherent disadvantage at their age. Second example. A person is born into a fundamentally dysfunctional family with low socioeconomic status, and their development is evidently hindered by these circumstances. Again, we would be hard-pressed to fault this individual for their disadvantage due to their family situation. These two examples are rather evident where I don't perceive the individuals involved as weak, at least in how I'm defining weakness, simply because they don't have control over those circumstances. Nevertheless, I mentioned earlier that the distinction can become blurred. Reusing the examples above will demonstrate this assertion rather aptly. For the bullying example, although the victim might not have control over their powerlessness in the current moment, eventually they'll gain more control as they grow older. Although there's an age difference, let's say for all intents and purposes that by the time the bullied kid is 10 years old, their stature parallels the aggressor's, who would now be 13 years old. In this case, the lack of physical stature or prowess is no longer an acceptable excuse. The bullied kid possesses a little more choice in the matter now. They can choose to either let the older kid persist in bullying them, or they can take a stand against it. Meanwhile, with the second example, the person born into less favorable socioeconomic circumstances can choose to overcome them if they possess the determination to achieve that objective. Or they can resign themselves and allow the cycle to continue. Which outcome arises is largely determinable through such a choice. Anyhow, this is where the line becomes blurred because there are aspects we can influence and there are others where we have no influence. The arduous task is affecting the controllable elements while simultaneously managing the uncontrollable elements. I suppose I've arrived at my overall conclusion in a roundabout way. You cannot afford to be weak in the sense that you must ameliorate life's inevitable hardships by influencing the controllable elements. You must choose to be strong, which entails making tough decisions, delaying instant gratification, and not succumbing to temptation simply because it's easy to do so. These comments lead me to the next section. Why is there a necessity to be strong and avoid weakness? As mentioned in the introduction, weaknesses will be exploited and life becomes more hellish when your character and decision-making abilities are brittle. In the fitness world, there are two cliché, but nevertheless insightful phrases which remark, "You are what you eat," and "Abs are made in the kitchen." Both phrases capture the same fundamental concept, decision-making and how your decisions have consequences. In this context, if you make good decisions by, i.e., foregoing junk food or tracking your calories, then you'll likely receive the positive reward of ideal body weight and shape. Meanwhile, if you do the opposite, your reward will likely be excess weight and other health problems. Sufferings and hardships inevitably become exacerbated through poor decisions that are facilitated by a weak resolve or will. We make numerous decisions every day, many of which are ostensibly insignificant and automatic, but they can have monumental impacts somewhere down the line. Otherwise known as the snowball effect, small decisions over a long period of time can compound to produce a monumental result. To avoid controllable weakness, your resolve and decision-making abilities must be strong. This requires a solid understanding of what you desire, or what you wish to achieve, and how you plan to obtain it. There will be doubts and uncertainty, but continually focusing on the ultimate goal will keep your ship steady as you navigate through life's various storms. If you fail to be strong and fail to minimize your weaknesses, then these insufficiencies and inadequacies will be exploited by others and life in general. A weakness of will that's often exploited involves addictions, and they're common examples of phenomena that don't occur overnight, but rather over a prolonged time frame where many conscious decisions lead to their manifestation. Partaking in a few alcoholic drinks every day might not seem like an addiction initially, but when you subconsciously consume more of those drinks as a coping mechanism, then it's even harder to notice. Before you realize it, you need alcohol to function and you go insane without this crutch. Now it's an addiction, and this example can be exchanged with almost any other. The point is that weaknesses will be exploited at every opportunity. In this case, a lackluster ability to resist temptation and instant gratification is exploited. A deficiency of will and character is controllable since you can make better decisions before you get to the point where something is all-consuming. It's possible that someone who is an alcoholic could have avoided that outcome if they swapped out alcoholic drinks for fizzy water or some other healthier alternative instead. I'm not remarking that it's easy, but habits can be altered if there is a conscious willingness to do so. The concluding section for today's discussion will now focus on some tangible methods that you can utilize to become stronger, physically, mentally, and emotionally, and I'll utilize some personal stories to illustrate these methods. Like a fair number of kids at some point, I was bullied in school. For me, it occurred in middle school, grades 7 through 8 primarily. Luckily enough, I wasn't physically bullied. Instead, it was psychological, and that's arguably worse than any physical injury. At the time, I wanted to fit in because although I gravitated towards solitude, I disliked the idea of total isolation or alienation. Ironically, the more I tried to fit in, the more alienated I became. I essentially had some friends who hung out with others who comprised the so-called popular group. In grades 7 and 8, I hung out with them as much as I could. Upon reflection, I suppose I was trying to get their approval in some delusional way, but it rarely worked. Even in the midst of my foolishness, deep down I knew where I stood on the totem pole, near the bottom, continuously left out, left behind, the butt of several jokes, alienated and disrespected on a number of occasions. All of that evidently hurt, but I kept putting up with it. It kept happening because I was perceived as weak, both physically and mentally, and this was evidently exploited by those willing to do so. This was true. I wasn't standing up for myself, and it was due to my weakness of will and character. And so, for a while, I kept deceiving myself into believing that things would get better and change. But of course, it ultimately proved to be a delusional fantasy. Once middle school concluded, I finally woke up and left them all behind. When I entered high school in grade 9, many of the people I formerly ran with also went there, but I couldn't care less. I decided to fully embrace my lone wolf tendencies and focus on my self-development, which paid immense dividends. I actively shunned groups and focused entirely on academics and athletics. Furthermore, I began lifting weights regularly, which served to dramatically enhance my self-confidence, and the increased physical strength and stature also positively affected my character. I gradually became firmer in my convictions, and other people noticed, including the members of the group that I formerly ran with. The result of my conscious decisions, strong decisions, to willingly embrace hardship and forgo instant gratification was great respect from others. While others were out drinking and partying every weekend, I was grinding away every weekend, and the results were remarkable. I gained respect for myself, in addition to the unexpected but nevertheless welcome recognition from others that I meant business and I wouldn't be trifled with. This only happened because I chose to be strong, instead of weak. I decided to make my circumstances better, instead of wallow in misery and let past traumas consume me. This dramatic improvement of character enabled me to effectively manage hardships until about second year at university when everything was put under severe strain. To date, it has been my lowest point because I was essentially beaten down and broken. I've mentioned this story before, where I was extremely depressed due to interpersonal relationship and family financial difficulties. I lost faith in myself, my abilities, and all I saw was gray. It was difficult to get out of bed each morning and face the day, but somehow I did. I often credit this strength and endurance to Jesus because I certainly lacked the strength at the time. He provided the tools, that extra strength and fuel to endure, but it was up to me to effectively use them. So, despite all the pain and sorrow, I actively chose to endure, and that decision was what made me strong. Rejecting weakness and embracing strength doesn't mean being strong all the time. It doesn't mean showing no emotion and not crying when you're feeling overwhelming sorrow. Even the mightiest warriors take off their armor at some point, so they can recuperate and fight in future battles. Therefore, shed your armor every so often so you can rest and eventually continue the fight. Become the person you once needed when you felt lost and hopeless, like I did when I couldn't contain my sorrow. Looking back, I wish my current self could travel back in time and be there for my past self, especially when I was alone and felt like the storm would never end. I wish I could go back to place a firm hand on my former self's shoulder and reassure him that everything would eventually be all right. Perhaps the suffering would have been more bearable if that took place. However, I also realized that I wouldn't have become as strong without the experience. I wouldn't be the man I am today without overcoming that intense hardship and learning to stand on my own 2 feet. There was, and still is, a purpose to the pain, and that purpose serves to make you strong. Character is forged in the flames of adversity, and this largely involves willingly embracing painful and uncomfortable endeavors. To become strong, you must venture out of your comfort zone by resisting temptation, impulsiveness, and instant gratification. Whether that's limiting junk food, spending less time on social media, saying no more often to other people, gradually walking or running further each day, or trying something again and again after continuously failing, you must consciously choose to confront the resistance that you'll encounter whenever you attempt to improve and make better decisions. It can be done if you're willing to try, and it must be performed because necessity demands it. Become the person you needed in your lowest moments by forgoing instant gratification and making better decisions. For the aspects that you can control, your mentality, individual circumstances, and relationships with others, choose to be strong and reject weakness by actively confronting difficulties. It'll be frustrating, painful, and stressful, but the results will be worth it. Remember, choose to be strong and not weak. The course of your future depends on it.